Well, good afternoon and welcome back. You know, this idea of keys for successful quarreling, that may seem like an oxymoron, kind of like military intelligence. You know, how do those two possibly go together? How does successful quarreling go together? That just doesn't sound right. But honestly, it really can. And I like the word quarreling better than fight, because really we want to have discussions, disagreements, not really fights. So, you know, everybody's going to quarrel. And as I mentioned earlier, the more people in a family, in some ways, the more complicated it becomes. I got this out of Parade magazine years ago. It says, one nice thing about being single, all the decisions are unanimous. And that's true. You know, people are happier if they're married, if they're happily married, than single people, but it is a simpler life, really, if you don't have to constantly try to get the approval of folks around you and try to work together in a partnership. It takes more interpersonal skill to be successfully married than it does to be a successful single, for that very reason. And so, as I alluded to in my prior remarks, conflict is inevitable. I like the quip that says a fellow who says he's never had an argument with his wife is apt to lie about other things too. So don't trust somebody who would say such a thing. Everybody at times is going to have disagreements. And I'll say this, if somebody says we never have had any disagreements, I think that's a red flag. Because it just means that somebody's not speaking up. Somebody's just always sort of being a doormat to the other person. And that's not healthy either. So when you have honest differences, the healthy thing to do is to discuss them so you can work through them and understand each other better. Research has found that there are 4 factors that they become chronic are precursors of divorce. These are sort of like 4 mines that if you step upon them, they will blow up any marriage. Criticism, particularly chronic criticism. When your mate becomes your biggest critic instead of your biggest fan, the bloom of romance is gone. And that's really important, not to be overly critical or be perceived as such. And then defensiveness and withdrawal. Now, what do those 4 things have in common? These 4 things that are the key indicators that a relationship is really in trouble. All 4 of them deal with conflict resolution, which is what we've been dedicating today to. And again, shows the importance of this particular subject. So remember that the key is not to figure out how to avoid conflict, but how to work through it appropriately. Because shutting down and not talking, though it may make everything calm, may cause one person to just eventually just walk away and everyone's shocked because they don't feel like they have a voice and they're not talking about things that need to be discussed. One writer said this, everybody focuses on mate selection on finding the right person. And they said the real issue is not so much finding the right person as learning to fight well with the person you've already found. Again, goes back to this idea of being able to work through difficulties and talk them through together. So let's talk about some general pointers here. Be careful. One zinger erases 20 positives. That's what the research says. Reckless words, they pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So the key idea here is, when in doubt, wait. You can always go back and say it later, but particularly if you say it in anger, you may say something that, you can apologize for saying it, but you still said it, and it's still there, and the hurt is done. So if you think about this love bank concept, which we're going to elaborate more on the lesson on Sunday, everybody's got this sort of emotional love tank, so to speak, within them. And when people have love banks that are full, they're usually enjoying life and pretty happy and feel good about their relationships. And when their love banks are sort of low or on empty or worse in the negative, that's when you have real serious issues. So because you could do all these positive things and sort of get positive points, and then one time you kind of lose it and say something really hurtful or insensitive, it takes a long time to make up for that as far as the love bank is concerned. So when in doubt, wait. He who restrains his lips is wise, Proverbs 10:19. All right. Relationships have momentum. I think about Proverbs 17:14. Starting a quarrel is like breaking a dam, so drop the matter before a dispute even breaks out. So you imagine somebody just kind of holding their finger on the dam and then they let it go, and before you know it, the whole water just comes from the dam, and you think, oh, what have I done? So this works in your favor and it works in your disfavor. I mean, you first meet someone, you enjoy their company, they say something nice to you, you say something back that's nice, and then you look forward to being with them again, and then on the next date you have a lot of fun, and they have fun, and you just learn things about one another, and it's all positive, and it kind of builds. And after a while, it's kind of like you just want to be around the person. It's like, read me the phone book, I don't care, just don't hang up, I just want to hear your voice. That's what it's like when you're just kind of almost emotionally obsessed with one another. There's a momentum factor. On the other hand, momentum can go the other way. You say something hurtful, they take offense and say something hurtful back, and then you respond with another verbal barb, and then they go, what? And before you know it, the whole thing's just going down this way really quick. And because of the nature of things kind of unraveling or things going downhill in that way, both parties, but I think especially the husband, who ought to take the lead here, I would say, wait a minute, this is going in the wrong direction. We love each other. Let's just stop saying things that are hurtful. Kind of, I encourage couples to use the timeout sign and just kind of say, I'm sorry, I love you, that was over the top, will you forgive me? And just sort of decide you're not going to allow this to continue to degenerate and walk out of the room and say things that, obviously a Christian man or woman shouldn't say and that you will regret later. But be aware of the tendency to sort of be like a snowball rolling downhill that sort of gains power over time. And beware of what the research would call the egalitarian marriage. And this is where, in the modern American marriage, this is what the books on marriage and family all promote. Everything's 50-50. No final arbitrator of disputes, no head of the house, and no established rules, really. Everything's a free-for-all, just kind of do what you want. And traditional roles as laid out in the Bible are eschewed and considered Pollyannish and old-fashioned. And frankly, one of the reasons why domestic abuse is so much on the increase in our country is the more you throw out the traditional roles, the more you just kind of have everything be a free-for-all, then the more everything just kind of becomes a battle of the wills. And instead of submitting one to another, as the Bible says, it's like trying to get some advantage over the other. And then if I don't get my way, well, I'll just walk out. That's kind of the spirit in the modern American home, unfortunately. The sad part is, last time I looked, a human being with two heads is a monster. It doesn't work. And it's not very attractive either. And so the biblical concept is God, Christ, man, woman, 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3. And there's a lot of confusion in our society between different roles and worth. And just because God assigns different roles in the marriage and the family, it has nothing to do with one party being worth more than the other or one party demeaning the other. And we understand this in every area of life, in business, in politics. You've got to have somebody that breaks the tie. But somehow or other, the modern American marriage is supposed to function without somebody who's at least an established tiebreaker. And so think about it just for a minute. In the United States Constitution, why do we have an odd number of Supreme Court justices? 9. So that if you had 10, what do you do when it's 5-5? You can't make a decision. And in the Senate, you've got 50 states, 2 senators from each state, but they provided for a tiebreaker. Who's that? The vice president is the tiebreaker, so you're not stuck. When I used to be an administrator at Florida College, there were times where some of my fellow administrators and I would disagree, especially over budget items and different decisions that had to be made. And the atmosphere there was they encouraged us to try to work out our differences between ourselves, but occasionally, if we just couldn't agree and we wanted to kind of fight for our department, we would ask for an appointment with President Caldwell. And we would plead our case before the president, and then he would make the call. And I remember one administrator in particular, a good friend of mine, Ralph Walker, we just said, well, let's just see what Colley says. And I said, all right, we just both presented our case. It's all amicable. And then we accepted what Colley said because he's the president and we're not. We're really his cabinet. We serve under him. And it just, there's no hard feelings. Somebody had to make a decision here. And it had nothing to do with the fact that the president is of some inherent worth more than we are as human people or as souls. It's that he's the president and we're not. Anywhere you go, in a company, there's a CEO who ultimately the buck stops at. Somebody's got to make these final decisions in every area of life except the modern American family. But in God's plan, he wanted it to be a cooperative partnership. He called the husband to be the servant leader, to love his wife sacrificially like Christ loved the church. And if any husband is really living up to that in any way, shape, or form, that kind of man is not hard to be in submission to, I'll tell you. My objective is to be the head of my house, but to be the kind of head where my wife is thankful for my leadership and not resentful of it. And that's certainly the goal that we want to have here. And so try to work it out. Try to establish some sort of amicable agreement whenever you can. Marriage is give and take, but if you honestly come to a situation where you just cannot agree. My wife has been really good over the years, and I really appreciate her for this. It hadn't happened very often, but we had a huge difference of opinion as to what we ought to do after I decided to leave Florida College after 26 years and go into full-time work. I was tired of juggling 2 jobs, and I was tired of being a director of development. I didn't like that nearly as much as teaching, and so reluctantly I decided to leave Florida College, and I thought we would stay in the area. To me, Tampa was home, my folks lived there, but my wife wanted to go up to Kentucky because that's where my 2 daughters were in school at the time. I said, honey, we can't chase our children all over the country. They're not going to be in Kentucky very long. She goes, well, we can do it for now. And so she wanted to move to Kentucky, and I wanted to stay put, and we just argued about that for a long time. And finally she said, I spoke my piece. I know you love me. I know you want to do what's best for the family. And so I will just pray for you to make a wise decision considering everyone's feelings. And whatever you decide, I will enthusiastically support. So I'll just pray that you have wisdom to make the right decision. And all of a sudden it was like, no more argument. It's just up to you. So we went to Kentucky. I did that without any resentment whatsoever because she left the decision up to me and she respected my leadership. And when we were in the middle of an ice storm and I was trying to dig ourselves out of snow and ice up in Kentucky, when I could have been in sunny Florida, I wasn't resentful. I wasn't thinking, if you just listened to me and we stayed in Florida, I wouldn't be in this ice storm. No, it's like, okay, this is just one of the things we got to learn to deal with now. And she was so sweet about it, and I didn't want to disappoint her, that I voluntarily made a decision that I would have not have preferred to make in order to please her. And yet she was being in submission, yet who got their way? I mean, to me, that's just a perfect example of how if you follow God's plan, everybody wins, you know? And at any rate, sometimes I'll do marriage counseling, and the husband sometimes is so resentful because he wanted to move to go up in his career, and the wife didn't want to move, and so he couldn't go up and get advancement in his career, and he never really advanced, and he didn't make much money, and they're both needing more money, and he blames the wife because if I'd taken that promotion when I had a chance, if you'd let me move, we wouldn't be in this mess, and all this resentment. Well, the wife really shouldn't have dug her heels in and insisted in something like that if she's going to allow the husband to be the head of the house. And things go so much better if we just have trust in God's plan. Another way I explain this that I think is helpful, in the scheme of redemption, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God the Father is the architect. Jesus is the one who executes the plan. And the Holy Spirit is the one who communicated and finished the plan. So they all work together. And Jesus says over and over again, that I just came to do the Father's will. I only speak what the Father tells me to speak. I only say what the Father tells me to say. Over and over again, he just says, I'm just doing the Father's will. I mean, they came up with this plan, and then, who's going to execute this? And Jesus raises his hand. And that's one of the reasons why we love Jesus, is he volunteered. Now, do we look down upon Jesus because in the scheme of redemption he took this submissive role voluntarily so that the scheme would work? No, we admire him and love him even more for giving up his life for us. So just because someone takes on a submissive role doesn't mean somehow or other, I want to be the boss. Listen, being the leader is not always the enviable position to be in. Having to make some of the tough calls is not always easy. Several times Gail has said, wow, I don't know what to do here, but that's really not my call, it's yours. It's true. And we're working together as a team here, just like when I worked with President Caldwell at the college. I mean, there wasn't competition. I just understood the roles. And so in spite of the fact of this being countercultural, we need to go back and accept the roles that God has laid out in the home and just make sure they're balanced. I mean, the husband is commanded to honor his wife, for she is a woman, and to cherish her, not to bark orders at her. That's a real misunderstanding of the teaching of submission. So, couples who have this kind of mindset, they get along better. It's more cooperative, and it works according to the way God planned. And by the way, let me say this as kind of a sideline. I've never known a couple where the man was henpecked by the wife that either party was really happy. And you probably won't either. Because deep down, I think every woman wants a man that she can look up to as a man, and that she can respect and look up to him as a pilot and provider and protector of her and the family. So even though sometimes women want to try to force their way in, if they succeed, neither one winds up being very happy. Because a woman doesn't respect a man that she can henpeck. So just think about that as we, once again, kind of talk about things that are politically incorrect. All right, now, what do most couples argue about? One of the things they found is that all couples, healthy couples, discuss things and quarrel about things. Now, if you go back and you look at marriage and family textbooks from like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, it's fascinating. And it talks about successful quarreling, resolving conflict, and the traditional issues that they dealt with and have always dealt with throughout the ages. This hasn't ever changed. I'm going to talk to you in a minute about two issues that have come up the last 30, 40 years that have changed dramatically. But what do you think of the four areas that couples have always going to quarrel about, have differences about?
Money and children.
Oh, okay, absolutely, Chuck. Money, money, money. You know, if you're a saver and she's a spender, and you guys can't quite agree on the budget and how you should spend your money, 2/3 of all divorces report financial strain and differences as a major factor. So, yeah, that's something you have to work out as a couple that may not even come up when you're dating. We're going to talk about the children in a minute. What's another thing that's likely to be next on my list? Most all couples find there are some challenges with, yes, in-laws or outlaws, as Chuck says. See, he's,
I
I thought you did.
keep that where it belongs.
Okay, that was back there. Okay, you get the credit for that. Okay, Chuck says, no, everybody just listen to this tape. I love my in-laws. The old joke is,
One of each. One that falls in each category.
yeah, the old joke is, what's the difference between in-laws and outlaws? Outlaws are wanted. But seriously, a lot of marriages, they have struggles in part because the woman especially sometimes wonders, you know, am I the number one woman in my husband's life, or is it still his mom? And I know of one fella who, just out of respect, would always come home, and first thing he'd do is greet his wife with a kiss. But when his folks were visiting, he would reach over and first he would kiss his mom on the cheek and then shake his dad's hand, and then he would kiss his wife. And later on, the wife indicated that she felt really embarrassed by that. And she thought, I know there are guests and you want to honor them, but I want to be the number one woman in your life. He goes, I can fix that. So the next time he maintained his pattern of kissing her first, and then he went over and kissed his mom on the cheek and then shook his father's hand. And that was a reassurance that his wife needed. And I think husbands need to be sensitive to that. That's a part of leave and cleave, right? You have to have severance. You have to somewhat break the emotional dependence that you have on the parents as you establish a new home. Years ago, I was working with a couple when I still worked at FC. And I just love premarital counseling. It was just a lot of fun and things that come up. And of course, couples are so much in love. And so this one couple, the guy was going to be, he still is, gospel preacher, and married this really sweet girl. And so I said, let's talk about resolving conflict. And they both looked at each other and said, you know, we discussed this, Brother Hunter, and we don't really think we need this. You know, we've been dating for quite a while, and we just got engaged, as you know, and we've never had an argument, and we just don't expect to ever need this. So we can skip over this part. And it was hard for me not to snicker a little bit at their naivete, so I took a risk. And I said, you don't think you need this, huh? No. I said, let me ask you a question. Where do you guys plan to spend your first Christmas as a married couple? And they both looked at each other and smiled and said, at my parents'. And then I just sat back and watched them have their first argument right there. Because they both couldn't imagine their first Christmas not at their parents'. But you know what? You've got to make a decision here. How are you going to work this out? I mean, there are issues that are going to come from in-laws on both sides. And so everybody at one time or another needs this. And of course, raising children, you know, with added choices come added decisions, which can make for conflict. I mean, before birth control, you just kind of waited and decided what the Lord was going to bring you when he brought it, right? And now with birth control, most couples wait a number of years before they have children. My wife and I waited 4, and that was good for us, that special time together as a couple. But then you have to decide, well, how many are we going to have, and how are we going to space them? You can't always work it out exactly, but it's a lot easier now with birth control and all that. And so there are going to be some advantages to that, but something else you have to agree on, right? And a lot of couples tell me that they did really well when it's just the two of them, but when the kids came, it's like that's when all the real pressure and stress and conflict came. Don't have a child to save a marriage, because children will put a strain on a marriage. Now, they're a blessing, I know, and but they can cause a lot of stress, especially when you got to wake up in the middle of the night and you got to feed them at inopportune times, and then you're walking around kind of exhausted. I mean, raising kids is tough. They're a blessing, but you've got to work out a deal. I'm so thankful that, when I was preaching and teaching at FC, that my wife said, I'll get up and feed Amy. You get some rest, because you got to get up and go to work. I'm a full-time mom. I can rest later in the day. And I thought, what if you had a full-time job too? Who gets to choose who gets to rest? I mean, that was really difficult. I just marvel at that. And so agreeing how you're going to raise the kids can be a challenge. And that's something that couples have always had to agree on and sometimes have differences over. Of course, the one area that no one's mentioned yet, but it's on everybody's mind probably, is sex. 2/3 of all marriages, sexual tension and differences is a major area of conflict. And I find that kind of interesting, because it's something that is special between you and your spouse, and only you and your spouse that you share. And it's designed by God to be pleasurable and something you look forward to, and yet something that couples often argue about, especially agreeing on frequency and other aspects of your sexual relationship, about which obviously you both have to be on the same page. And so that sometimes is an unexpected area of tension. And I just got back from a marriage seminar a couple of months ago at Powers Ferry Road in Atlanta, and the elders asked me to do a special session. You had to be high school and up, where I talked about sexual intimacy in marriage and things that you have to deal with and things to consider in making sure that that's a positive thing and not an area of conflict. And I think it's a shame, but most congregations don't have a forum in which we can talk about those things and deal with it in a righteous way and in a biblical way. But that's obviously also important. Now, the next thing that I was surprised they were talking about hundreds of years ago, it's always been an issue, one of my favorite, because I find it kind of humorous, and that is tremendous trifles. So the word tremendous, of course, it means it becomes very important, and yet it's really something very small. Small, theoretically inconsequential things that drive most people to the brink of mayhem, divorce, or screaming memes is one quote that I thought was humorous. So, anybody got some examples of tremendous trifles?
Toilet seat.
What's that?
Toilet seat.
Okay, Whoopi Goldberg has a famous quote. She says, she was asked about why there's so many divorces, and her quip was, women can't stand how men constantly leave the toilet seat up. And so you agree with Whoopi Goldberg. Yes, for many, I know that's an insult, Ron, I couldn't resist. But at any rate, little things like that, they're little things, but they can be rather irritating, and is something that most men in a marriage have to remind themselves to do, especially so their wives don't get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and wind up sitting in the toilet. It just doesn't go over very well. When we first got married, I didn't know that my wife, Gail, grew up in a home where you would never dog-ear the pages of a magazine or a book. They would use bookmarks. Well, in the Hunter house, we didn't mess with bookmarks. And if you were reading something and, you were called to dinner or whatever, you bookmark the page so you can come back later and find it. It was no big deal. And so we've been married a couple of weeks, and Gail takes me aside and says, "Why have you been ruining my magazines?" I said, "What? I've been ruining your magazines." Well, "Yeah, you have. Look at." She pointed out where I dog-eared the pages of a couple of her magazines, just a little dog-ear on the top of the page. I said, "Really? That bothers you?" She goes, "Yeah." She goes, "Use the bookmark." I said, "A bookmark in a magazine?" She goes, "Yes." she kind of basically thought what I was doing was tasteless or something, and so I said, okay, I didn't know that would bother you, so I said, I'll not do that anymore. Problem is, I repeatedly did that. Not because I was saying I'm going to do it anyway, but because it's subconscious and I kept on forgetting. It was just a bad habit. So I'm just curious, how many of you were raised in a home like mine where it was no big deal to dog-ear the page of a magazine or a book? Okay? Most of you are normal, I see that, okay? And what about the rest of you? Any of you, you just don't dog-ear the page? Okay, all right, all right, so Fords are that way. So that's okay. Everybody's different. And I was joking about the normal thing. That's actually something you should never say about your way is normal and their way is abnormal. That's really hitting below the belt, which is what you need to avoid when you deal with conflict. I read about this and I got a big kick out of it. One man on his 25th wedding anniversary figured he'd kicked the sheets loose 7,500 times, that it had taken him at least a minute each night. He figured he had wasted 125 hours of his life since he got married fighting with his wife over the sheets. And that's what he chose to talk about on their 25th wedding anniversary, because apparently his wife was one of those, she wants to be snug like a bug in a rug kind of a person, and even if it's really hot, she likes to have the blanket or the sheet around her. And he felt confined by that, and so she would get into bed first, and then he'd kick the sheets loose. And they'd go through that routine for 25 years, every night. That would get old, you think? So, the good news is, if the relationship is overall solid, you can work through your tremendous trifles. It's not going to destroy a marriage. But if there's other issues that are a problem, this may be the straw that breaks the camel's back that causes you to go to the divorce court. And that's why some people will use this kind of toilet seat idea as the reason for the divorce. Not really the reason. Okay, so next question. So what do you think are now the top two issues that supersede in the typical American marriage all those others? The two top issues that couples last 30 years especially have really quarreled about a lot.
Household chores.
Yes, yeah. It may be, I don't know. This research I have here, is not, it's at least 10 years old. So maybe now they'd add politics. I don't know. But the answer, at least as of 10 years ago, was who does the domestic chores? And then the other one is akin to this, and that is how do you spend your precious leisure time? Because in most modern American homes, you have a dual career couple where both decide, I want to use my education, I want to go to work, and a lot of times they decide, I really, want to work, that's kind of who I am, and so it's not like they're being forced. A lot of times that's what they prefer. And that's okay. But what happens in many cases is the husband maybe grew up in a home where the mom did most of the, quote, housework. And he wants to come home from a long day at the office or a long day at work and kind of unwind and read the paper while his wife fixes the food and takes care of everything in the kitchen, and then he waits to be called to dinner, and then she does the dishes. And well, that's okay if the wife's primary responsibility is in the home and that's her job. And the husband's primary responsibility is to be the breadwinner. Neither party is kind of put on tilt mode if you share those responsibilities. But if the wife is working just as hard as the husband, and she comes home after a hard day at the office, just like the husband has, and then the husband expects the wife to wait on him when she's exhausted, there's a lot of resentment that comes from that. And you know what? I think that's unfair. Because you wind up having the wife have double duty if she does most of the domestic chores and the husband doesn't share the load. My wife's a dietitian, and there were times where she would work part-time as a dietitian, and when she would bring in some extra income, I'd say, thank you for helping with my job as the provider. Because God told Adam to work by the sweat of his face, not the woman. It's the husband's primary provider role. Can the wife help with that if she wants to? Sure. Should she be forced to? I don't think so. I think the wife should only work outside the home if she wants to. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. In fact, when both parties work and you have 2 or 3 kids, the research says the chances of divorce double because the stress is just overwhelming. So hard to juggle it all. In fact, there was a USA Today study a while back, and they asked these women who had, prestigious careers and worked full-time and had a husband and children and lots of money, and this is the ultimate liberation, woman kind of a scenario. And so they said, so what would you say is the one word that you would use to describe your life? You want to know the most common word that these women volunteered? Exhaustion. That was the most common word, and they all said, I feel very liberated. I feel like I just work constantly and I never get a break. You're just spread too thin. This is my suggestion. Maybe you can have it all, but I just don't think at the same time. You got to make some choices if you're going to have children in the home. And why have children and have someone else raise them in a daycare anyway? But the thing that I find quite amazing to me is that who can handle a double shift better? Which one of the gender generally has more stamina?
Woman.
No, that's not true. In fact, if you take a drop of a typical man's blood, red blood, and you take a drop of a woman's blood and you look at them underneath a microscope, excuse me, the man is going to have 1,000 more hemoglobin red blood cells in his blood than the typical woman. He's got much greater ability. They have greater stamina. That's why they make better soldiers. They have more stamina. They have more strength. They're able to handle a double shift much more so than the woman. And yet, in a lot of homes, it's the woman who gets stuck working 2 jobs. And so, I think every couple needs to just count the cost and sort out what is fair. Because you have a lot of resentment if one party feels like the other is unfairly stuck with a lot of things that they would rather have shared. And you got the same issue with leisure time. If both parties are working, and then you've got to, when you get home, come up with some sort of fair division of the domestic chores, there's very little discretionary time left. So in the typical American family, you have more money than you have discretionary time. It didn't used to be that way. So how are we going to spend this precious discretionary time? Whose friends are we going to spend it with? What are we going to do in our leisure time? And it becomes very important as there's less and less leisure time to go around. So it becomes a major conflict as to whose social activities that you agree to go to and who you don't. And, again, if you can put first things first and still have both parties work outside the home, then more power to you. But it is a juggling act, and it puts a lot of stress on a marriage. So just be aware of that. I'm not making judgments here. I'm just saying make sure that you count the cost and you talk that through. Okay. I mentioned this. I think this is important. Ironically, people say, okay, what's the difference between happy and unhappy couples? I want to be a happy couple. Well, happy couples have some margin in their life. They don't have everything so overbooked that everything is stressed, and if one little thing gets out of whack, then everything is thrown off because there's no margin, there's no give. And most of us probably are trying to do too much in order to have somewhat of an enjoyable, restful life that can handle unexpected things that come up. So happy couples understand that, and they arrange so that they've got some margin in their life. You know, we don't resent reading a book that has some white space in it, between the lines and on both sides. And yet we lead lives that oftentimes, if you were to look at them, the print's everywhere and there's hardly any white space. And deep down, that's a reason why so many people look back at their life and wish they'd spent more time to smell the roses. So, what is the difference between happy and unhappy couples? Ironically, both happy and unhappy couples argue about the same things. And the amount of disagreements and how often the parties disagree is not a significant factor in marital satisfaction. It's how the parties argue. Happy couples argue as if the issue is external to the relationship. They may disagree, but it doesn't change their respect or feelings for each other. Unhappy couples get personal. Well, if you weren't so selfish, you wouldn't feel that way. If you were normal, you'd understand that that's not a reasonable point of view. If you had any taste at all, you would understand why that tie doesn't go with that shirt. That's the kind of stuff that unhappy couples say to one another that shows disrespect and is a put down. Happy couples who respect and love one another are able to keep the discussion out here. Oh, that's funny. I don't see it that way. You see it that way? Why is that? Well, because of this. Oh, really? In other words, you're talking about it out here, and you don't affect how you feel about each other, and you're not attacking each other because you have some differences. That's why I gave you the 10 keys for fighting fair. Because if you stay within those boundaries, you'll be a happy couple that can discuss anything without getting personal. The other thing I found quite amazing is there were two sociologists, Mudd and Hay. Boy, what two last names that go together not so well, right? But anyway, Mudd and Hay, they said the real problem that marriage counselors find is the relation itself and not the peripheral issues. And I found this as well. Typically, when a couple comes for counseling, they tend to talk about peripheral issues. You know, the tremendous trifles, the differences in the budget, just irritants, annoying habits, peripheral issues. And so you solve those things. You have them work out a budget they agree on. You deal with these different things. You get rid of the tremendous trifles, and then something else comes up. It's always something else. And the reason is they aren't telling you what the real problem is. And sometimes they're not even aware of what the real problem is themselves. So they pick on these things on the periphery. Mudd and Hay found that the only time the marriage is really in trouble and what you need to really focus in on is not the peripheral things, but the central things. If one party feels lonely, even though they're married, or unloved, and put down and criticized by their spouse, that marriage is not supporting each other like they should. That's a real issue. If one party feels like, well, we just can't communicate. I try, and every time we do, it just escalates into an argument, so I just sort of shut it down. That's that avoidance of conflict that often occurs. You get to the point where you just can't communicate. My spouse doesn't understand me. You lose perspective on what you mean to one another. Or if you feel rejected and unworthy, those are the things that if a couple says, yeah, I feel that way, and you sometimes have to ask them in private without the other party even hearing, that's what has to be dealt with if you're going to get to the core of what the real problem is. And if you deal with these successfully, then these other peripheral issues usually just sort of disappear. They're not really that much of a problem to begin with. They were just sort of something that was easier to talk about than these things. So happy couples are very careful also not even to think about, much less ever bring up what researchers call the fatal thought. The fatal words that oftentimes ultimately end the marriage. You know what I'm talking about? You know what the fatal thought is? The D word. Why is it so devastating to the marriage for one party to even start talking about divorce? You know, if things don't get better, I may just have to walk. This is just not working out. That threat will be more likely to bring about that reality than about anything you could possibly do. Because if you're in this, what should be a jump in feet first commitment until death do you part relationship, and one party starts talking about bailing, is that going to hurt? Like you wouldn't believe. So if the other person is making that threat, what are you going to do emotionally on the other side of that? You're going to back off. Because if you decide to walk away from me, I got to protect myself from being hurt. And so when you back away from the other person emotionally, is that going to help the relationship or hurt it? It's going to hurt it terribly. Then the other person feels you backing off, and they were already somewhat unhappy, and so they say, okay, I'm going to file. There's a huge difference between talking to somebody that you love and that you know you're committed to until death do you part, and talking to somebody that at any minute may walk out because they're unhappy with you for some reason. Huge difference. So I've had people tell me in private they were thinking about getting a divorce, and I go, oh, please, no. Let's not even go there. And I hope you haven't told your spouse that, because that will change everything. The atmosphere completely goes sour. Because you got to trust one another for this to work. And of course, very similar to that is I don't love you anymore. You know, that's not as bad as threatening the D word, but it's almost. So, you know, you frustrate me right now. I'm angry at you, but I still love you and I want this to work. That's the productive message. And we're going to somehow or other figure out a way to work this out. Any thoughts about that? It's really important.
I do, Brent.
Yes, go ahead, Kathy.
So, Ron and I went into marriage, no marriage counseling, no premarital classes. You know, we didn't have any of that. We didn't write our own vows. We didn't know what we were getting into. We were kids. And so somehow we figured a few things out. And that is one thing we just said, that's never going to be in our dialogue. You can't, let's just never use that word. I've heard that before among brethren, like they make a rule. We just won't use that word. There's a lot more to it than not using the word, but it makes a difference.
It does.
If you could remember one thing, you know, today.
Yeah, and you guys both had enough sense to find the Lord together too, and that made all the difference too, didn't it? Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that testimony. That's exactly right. That's the commitment you need to have. And that's why this done in a premarital setting is so vital, is you make sure that people understand that up front. Even if you think it, don't say it and try to get it out of your head, because there's no point in you to even think it. All right. Now, I want to conclude this part one session with what happens during conflict that is so crucial. When I first learned this was like this aha experience. I mean, I had never realized this before, and it has given me such a wonderful tool now to understand what's going on and to help couples. And many times, if a couple comes to me in crisis, one of the first things I do is talk to them about this. And let me say this also. I know that most of you that are taking a Saturday afternoon out like this to hear classes like this, probably in pretty good shape spiritually and in your marriages. So you may not need what I'm about to say, but I'm sure you know couples that do. And I want you to take the material that I've given you and things like what I'm about to talk about and understand, I know how to give couples hope and give them insight to help them work through difficulties so they don't see divorce as an option. Okay, so listen to this, not just through your own relationship, but through other people you know that could use help. Because I want churches to be a hospital for sinners, not just a museum for saints. I want us to know how to be true ministers that can really help people in crisis and do it to the glory of God. And to do that, though, I think we need some fairly sophisticated tools at times. And that's what this is about. Understand this about conflict. Everybody has 3 stages when it comes to conflict. This first one is intimacy. Everybody gets married for intimacy, and that's good. Intimacy, somebody who really is my soulmate. No problem with that. But what happens is every couple eventually finds that there's hurt, there's frustration, there's disappointment. We're human beings. And so you find yourself entering into conflict. Now, if you talk through the conflict, and Brent finally learns a new habit and stops dog-earing pages of books that bothers Gail, then we can go back to intimacy, right? So every couple is going to be doing this all the time. If you can successfully not let the sun go down upon your wrath, and if you can successfully get back to intimacy, you're good. However, what happens if you come over here and there's like this unresolved conflict? You didn't get over it, you didn't come to any agreement, you kind of agree to disagree, and then you try to go back to intimacy, but there's this little brick there now. And then you go back to somewhat intimacy, but there's this brick there in the background, and then something else comes up, and it's another unresolved conflict, and we don't know how to fight fair, and it didn't go well, and we wound up calling each other names, and it ended poorly, and then we go back to kind of, well, I'm going to avoid that subject, and now you got another brick. So this goes on and on over the years until you have all these unresolved conflicts and all of these bricks, and usually the communication starts to really break down. And then suddenly, one or both parties, usually one at a time, not at the same time, and usually the woman, because she's more emotionally sensitive, they don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to quit, I've had it, I'm going to go into emotional withdrawal. It's not a conscious decision. It's a coping mechanism. You're so frustrated, and I can't communicate with this person, and they don't seem to understand me, and I've been hurt, and he said things to me that just went deep down into my soul, and words of my love language, and this is just, I can't get it out of my head, and you're just going through all this stuff, and then all of a sudden, snap! You go into withdrawal, and all these bricks align together into a wall. And walls in a marriage are your greatest enemy. It's what you need to try to avoid at all costs, is having walls between them. Remember, passion is the free exchange of feeling. And when you got a wall between you, the passion and the romance is gone. And so I will draw ICW out there, and I'll explain this to them, and I'll say, okay, you guys been having a lot of unresolved conflict. You wouldn't be here to see me, right? And they go, oh yeah. I go, okay, is either one of you in withdrawal? And most of the time, immediately, the one that's in withdrawal will say, yeah, that's me. And you know why people usually come to counseling? It's the person on the other side of that emotional withdrawal that senses that, uh-oh, something's really wrong here. And nothing I do seems to please him or her. And they're usually the one who wants to fix it. And the person who's got this wall up to protect themselves from the hurt oftentimes doesn't want counseling because they don't want to give up this wall. But understanding what's happening is critical. And if both parties have put up walls, boy, that's really hard to fix. Hopefully just one. But you got to know what you're dealing with. And the couple needs to know what's happened. And understanding this dynamic is really, really important. So, what happens during conflict that is so critical? Entering into stage 3 is really serious because you become emotionally disconnected from the other person. The feelings are gone. This is where a person says, I don't have feelings for you anymore. And they don't, because they put up this wall. And this is where you often hear, I don't love you. But what the person who goes into withdrawal doesn't realize is the wall keeps out both good and bad. So if somebody's been giving you these critical statements and these verbal barbs, and you finally had it, and you just snap and put up this wall, not only does it cause you to be able to not be hurt by the barbs anymore because you got this wall up, but sadly, the person often says, oh man, I'm really losing my spouse here. I can see it in their eyes. So, you start being thoughtful. You start maybe bringing her flowers. She throws them in the trash. She doesn't want any flowers. The person that's emotionally withdrawn and disconnected, I don't want anything to do with you. And maybe they'll say, hey, let's go out, let's have fun. No, I don't want to be with you. Then you write her a love letter. She would have loved it 2 months ago, but not now that she's in withdrawal. Now she's like, eh. So the wall keeps out the positives. It's like Cupid's arrows hit the wall and then just fall down every time you try. And then eventually what happens is the guy who's trying to win back his wife, and everything he does, she throws it back in his face. Eventually he gets tired of being rejected, and then his wall goes up. And that's where usually the marriage is very hard to fix. But understanding that is really critical. So, doing all the right things, trying to meet your spouse's needs if one is in withdrawal is a waste of time. It's just going to be an act of frustration. So, you need to understand that withdrawal is serious, but not necessarily permanent. And as I've said, when the sharing of feelings stops, passion dies. This is really important. Listen to this next point. This is the strange irony about romantic love. When you have it, you're standing there at the altar, and there's a mad rush sometimes to the altar. Can't wait to get married. This is going to be wonderful. You think, man, it's you and me, babe, against the world. You think you could never lose it. You've got something so special. People are often really naive about how what they feel is so real that, it's going to be this way for the rest of their life. 37% of first-time marriages in America end up in the divorce court. And all those people felt that way at the start. So that ought to tell you that romantic love, though it can be very strong, it's also very fragile if it's not paid the proper attention to. The easiest way to get rid of romantic love is just to starve it out. Get busy about other things. Really sad. A lot of men stand at the altar, and instead of saying I do, they say I'm done. I got my wife, ring on her finger, now I can chase the corporate ladder, now I can do other things. And the poor wife married the person thinking that the way they were when they were dating is the way it's going to be throughout the marriage. Well, that seems fair to me, but most of the time that's not what happens. And so eventually you get so hurt from being ignored and rejected that you put this wall up. And the husband often learns to hate the wall that he himself erected because she's just kind of unreachable. So when you have it, you think you can never lose it. But when you lose it, like when you go into withdrawal, you think it can never be regained. I've had people tell me, Brother Hunter, I'm in a loveless marriage. Please, I got to get out of this. I know she hasn't committed adultery on me, but I'm telling you, this marriage is just loveless. I don't want to live in a loveless. I don't want to live this way the rest of my life. I said, you don't have to live this way the rest of your life, but you're assuming that a loveless marriage can't turn back into a loving marriage with the right kind of work. No, that's not possible. Yes, it is possible. And I've seen it happen over and over again. Romantic love can be reborn if you can feel safe to share feelings again, and if trust can be reestablished so you can process the conflict, and you get back to having intimacy. But it's amazing how resistant people are to thinking it's even possible. Isn't that ironic? First they think they can never lose it, then after they lose it, they think they can never get it back. I've looked at couples and I've said, you're Christians, right? Yes. Okay, now you're telling me your love is dead. I believe you. You ought to know. But I've got good news for you. You serve a God who specializes in the resurrection from the dead. That is the very basis of our faith. Do you believe Jesus Christ came forth from that tomb? That he was resurrected from the dead? Yes. Then you have to believe the same power that brought forth Jesus from the tomb is the same power if you'll let it work within you. And if you'll follow this process that I'm going to help you with, that you can take that dead love into the glory of God, you can resurrect it to be more than it has ever been. So some of this has to do with faith. Yes?
It kind of makes sense because you, to me anyway, you lose it by not working at it. So you weren't recognizing that you were maintaining it by working at it.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that it's gone, you don't recognize that working at it brings it back.
Chuck, very well said. Very well said. I don't know about you, but is this a fascinating insight to you? It was to me. And so I tell the husband, stop the flowers, stop all the stuff you've been trying to do to woo her. You have to identify the offenses. You've got to take each brick in that wall, one by one, and you need to acknowledge them and accept them and understand them, and then humbly ask for forgiveness, and then hope she can find it in her heart to forgive you. Because if she does, guess what happens? The wall comes tumbling down. And now you can start making deposits again and fall in love again. You know, the beauty of what I'm going to describe to you is that what happens in nature when you break a bone? Well, if you set it properly and it heals back, where it broke, it will be stronger than any other part of the arm. If you put stress on that arm again, it may break, but not in the place where it broke before, because nature has a way of protecting itself. And so if a couple goes through this successfully, and they're able to figure out how to forgive one another and how to acknowledge offenses and how to get over emotional withdrawal and fall in love again, they are a stronger couple than if they never went through this crisis at all. And now they can go on their own ministry and help other couples have their marriages saved because we did it, you can too. And it's just great to witness when people surrender themselves to God's will and understand the process and are willing to identify each offense, ask for forgiveness, and get forgiveness, and then finally start acting in ways where the other party feels safe. No reason for the wall anymore because I'm never going to lose it and curse at you again like I did that caused you to go into withdrawal. And then you establish the trust over time. Listen, trust goes out in buckets, but it comes back in drops. So it takes time. And some people say, oh, it's just so painful to go through the conflict and all those things again. Yes, it is difficult. And yes, it is painful. And yes, you will need a third party to help you through it. But it is not as painful as divorce and broken homes and broken hearts. It's worth it. But you just have to be really humble and restore the intimacy. You see, if you can stay in stage 1, intimacy, and you can avoid stage 3, which is withdrawal, you will be happily married. It is not really that difficult. But you've got to understand that if the wall has developed, you must be willing to go back through the conflict. See, you got to ICW over time, and you're not going to just say, well, forgive me of my sins in some generic way and expect the wall to come down. No, what you have to do is to go back through all the bricks in the wall, all the conflict, deal with them, and then the wall will come down, and then you can have intimacy. But to have this work, you've got to understand forgiveness. And some marriages fail simply because one party or both has an unforgiving heart. So let's take about a 5-minute break, and then we're going to talk about forgiveness. See why that fits? You guys are great listeners. Thank you so much. I'll see you in about 5 minutes, 5-7 minutes.